Brexit makes Boris Johnson unsackable, but not for much longer. I'm Mike Cashman. If you find the ideas in here useful, please subscribe to the channel. Dominic Cummings said that within days of the 2019 general election, he and a number of other shadowy figures, who he didn't name, discussed the idea of deposing Boris Johnson as Prime Minister. This is nonsense. I'm not saying that the discussion didn't happen. Maybe it did, either because Dominic Cummings is deluded or because he wanted to see what the impact on the other people would be of making the suggestion. But it's a nonsense idea for two reasons. One is the very obvious one, that if you promote to the country a certain person as Prime Minister and campaign vigorously for that, and then once you have got their votes, turn round and say that the person is absolutely incompetent to be Prime Minister, as indeed Dominic Cummings has done. But if you do that within days of the election, then it suggests that you've got no moral compass at all, no degree of responsibility, that you believe you can manipulate people, that the end justifies the means. That's the obvious reason. But there's another reason as well, and it's to do with Brexit and the Brexit mess. Nobody else wants to deal with Boris Johnson's Brexit mess. Look, in the middle of 2019, there were plenty of contenders for the Tory leadership when the vacancy was there, when there was some possibility of dealing with the Brexit situation. But once Boris Johnson had determined his Brexit mess, including the Northern Ireland Protocol, which Dominic Cummings said Johnson never intended to follow through, then a mess has been created that nobody else wanted to take responsibility for. Look, if Brexit was going to be so wonderful, was going to yield all sorts of benefits, then there would have been plenty of people prepared to take over the leadership from Johnson. If a possibility had arisen, at the very moment of triumph, of marching in and receiving all the accolades for the wonderful Brexit, there would have been plenty of people who wanted to do that. Nobody did, because they knew it was going to be a mess, and so they left Johnson to sort it out. It's worth looking at the motivations of potential leaders of the Tory party and of Tory MPs. So I'll come to the MPs later, but the potential leaders. If you want to be a leader of the Tory party and then Prime Minister as a result of taking over from Boris Johnson, then you'll want a decent run at the job for a year or two before the general election of 2024 or 2023. Perhaps that will allow you to say something like, well, my government has only been in power for a couple of years, and during that time, and then you have some guff about hospitals and nurses and teachers and schools and levelling up and police and whatever other dubious claims you can make. Which is probably not true, but you've distanced yourself from the, dare I say it, 12 years of Tory misrule, and you attribute the major damage of Brexit and COVID to your predecessor, without actually saying so, but you just make it clear that you would have done things differently. And we'll come back to that, actually. But by the time we get to 2019, late 2019, Brexit was not something to be looked forward to, and the very slogan, "Get Brexit Done," indicated that here is something that, some people felt had to be got through, was an unfortunate necessity. Let's get it done and over with, like an unwanted surgical operation, an amputation or something like that. It's got to be done sometime, so let's get it over with. There was no talk of Brexit benefits, of sunlit uplands. That had all, or they need us more than we need them. That had all gone. So there were no positive connotations, even as promised by the Tory party. If it had been a positive thing, you'd have had people wanting to take over, to pick up the positive impact of Brexit. Now, the impact of Brexit is not fully experienced yet. The full Brexit protocols are not being applied. There are grace periods. Tories are talking about renegotiating what they agreed even before they've implemented it. They haven't come up with any period for proper implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol, and the full adverse effects of Brexit are masked by COVID. So professionals have enormous obstacles working in Europe, but they can't travel in Europe anyway. The shelves of many supermarkets are empty, supposedly in some people's minds because of the pandemic, but without taking account of the shortage of heavy goods vehicles drivers that have arisen from Brexit. So there's lots of mess to deal with, and nobody particularly wants to pick up that poisoned chalice at the moment. Now let's look at the motivation of Tory MPs. MPs tend to want a couple of things. Number one, to get elected, and number two, to get promoted into government jobs in a career of increasing seniority. I said this to somebody who said, Mike, you're tremendously cynical. MPs want to do some good for the country. But no, I'm not cynical at all. In order to do some good for the country, they want to get elected and they want to get into a senior job. So whatever you think of their underlying motivations, these are two things that they want. Let's look at core Tory beliefs and values. Core Conservative beliefs and values are about winning elections, and they'll sacrifice a lot in order to win election, as we've seen with the sacrificing of all sorts of morals and principles in order to put Johnson in. And they tend to elect leaders with strong beliefs. But when those strong beliefs eventually turn into what they perceive as stubbornness, then they get rid of those leaders. That's what they did with Ted Heath, that's what they did with Margaret Thatcher, and ultimately with Theresa May. Now, Boris Johnson is an extremist. He's an extreme anti-democrat. He doesn't believe in power resting with Parliament. He made all his MPs effectively sign a pledge to say they wouldn't disagree with whatever deal he agreed, so they were signing away their right to use their brains. He doesn't believe in power resting with Cabinet. Cummings said, and I think that's probably the case, that many of the Cabinet meetings were token gestures. Johnson believes in taking power away from the judiciary, away from journalists who he likes to exclude from briefings, from the public who he wants to stop protesting, and from voters with voter ID proof. Johnson is actually uniquely vulnerable mid-term. Let's think of those Tory MP objectives: get elected and get promoted. In 2019, the prime focus was on getting re-elected. They identified correctly that a general election fought on Brexit grounds would confer electoral advantage to the Tories. This is a matter of electoral distribution. The support for Brexit is for leaving the EU was small minorities in a large number of constituencies, whereas the Remain support was more concentrated, for example, in some metropolitan areas. So that means that under our electoral system, small minorities in favour of leave would result in a majority of Tory MPs. So a general election was always going to give the advantage to the Tories if fought on Brexit grounds. So, 54% of MPs are Tories, and I'm sure you understand that that doesn't mean that 54% of the electorate voted Tory. But Johnson is a definite anti-democrat. He conceals it with this kind of amiable buffoon act, but nevertheless, he is extreme, probably more extreme than the vast majority of the Tory party are happy with. Look, you may disagree with many of the Tories, I may disagree with many of the Tories, but they are not all as extreme as Johnson, and that may cause them to reject him as he becomes more and more extreme. That's the pattern. Ultimately, Tories do, more often than not, change their leader between general elections, and that is even true of elections that they have won marginally. It's marginally true if you look at post-war elections. So it's certainly not unheard of if you look at that from World War II onwards. We're in unusual times, but the Conservative Party has existed for a long time and has so far avoided destroying itself, though it could be argued it's done a lot of damage to its morals and principles recently. And, you may look at what it's doing now, say it's thrown everything away, but who knows? Maybe it has the ability to survive, maybe to reinvent itself to some extent. The Johnson, though, is particularly vulnerable mid-term because, bearing in mind his approach, half or so of the party know that they're never going to get promoted by Johnson. Now, this is different from most Tory prime ministers. Most Tory prime ministers assemble all wings of the party within their cabinet, so that their key rivals, the key people who think differently from them, they've got them within the tent and they can hear the objections in cabinet and work things through. Johnson hasn't done that. He put a higher priority on blind loyalty, compliance, obedience. That was more important than competence, and that's why we've got such a second-rate cabinet. So, as I say, that means half the Tory party knows that they're never going to get promoted, never going to get a significant promotion under Johnson. So, although at the time of the election, leading up to that in 2019, the election that they hoped to happen and which did, although they backed him at the time of the election, now mid-term, with the next election a little way off, they want promotion. Would Johnson really be successful at another general election? Given his record, there must be some doubt about that. So I've talked about what might happen if there was a leadership challenge for Johnson, because these things happen when the leader isn't expecting it. They happen quite quickly. The thing about the Tory party is they don't generally agonise for a long time about who should be leader. Theresa May was slightly different because of the Brexit issues, but usually once the unrest has reached a particular level, then they actually arrange a new leader quite quickly. They don't spend ages in between that time agonising over it, and having chosen the new leader, they get behind him. They tend to stick with them. The Labour Party could probably learn something from that if they want to be electorally successful. So there could be a leadership challenge. Now, people often say, yes, but if we got another leader, another Tory leader, what would be the difference? It'd just be Michael Gove with the same mixture as before. I don't think so. Brexit gave the Tories electoral advantage in 2019, but that Brexit magic dust has been scattered and gone. There's no particular reason for somebody from the same mould to be chosen again. And taking Michael Gove, for example, the Tories actually don't tend to elect, has tried and failed for the leadership several times before. It is quite usual that a new Tory leader signals something of a departure from the previous policy, something of a difference. Sometimes some people expect the new leader, if they have been a follower of the existing leader, sometimes they say, oh, well, they're a close supporter and they'll carry on governing in the same way. So Margaret Thatcher expected that from John Major. That never happens. And there's a very simple reason for that. The new Prime Minister wants to make their mark. Nobody goes into politics in order to be a Me Too Prime Minister. Oh, she carried on just the way as before. They go into politics in order to make their mark, and as a new Prime Minister, they want to signal that within the first 3 months. Any loyalty that was displayed to the previous leader was because of seeking to not rock the boat and seeming to appear loyal, rather than because they believed exactly the same things. So you can see that a change is possible. Now, it's more likely if we get a leader from outside the cabinet. That's not that usual. On the other hand, the current cabinet has mightily disgraced itself. Heaven help us if we do get a Patel or a Raab. Sunak is one that's been touted, and I see Cummings is not seeking to do the dirty on some of these people, so he may have his plans, but he may not be successful. It's worth reading the book Failures of State about the coronavirus pandemic to understand Sunak's role in that. There are, in my view, people who are more honest and competent outside the cabinet. I look particularly at the chairs of select committees. There are people there that have been chosen by their fellow MPs, having capabilities of leadership and competence and integrity. People like Tobias Ellwood, Tom Tugendhat, Greg Clark. You've got Jeremy Hunt there as well. Very often, the new Tory leader is not someone that was necessarily expected to be the leader at the start of the contest. So, I think there are possibilities there. A new leader could take the Tory party in a different direction. Who knows? given the trade difficulties, considering rejoining the single market in the customs union, perhaps with some agreement about immigration to ease the concerns of the strongly anti-immigration Brexiters without necessarily compromising the principles of the single market. It would have been possible to go further with controls on immigration than we actually did. I'm not saying that's the most important issue, but it might be a significant issue in terms of gaining support. It's important to bear in mind, of course, that the two favourite candidates chosen by the MPs, by the parliamentary Tory MPs, are then put to the Tory party and the country as a whole. So ideally, one would want two viable candidates to be put to the country, you know, people of the calibre of Greg Clark, Tobias Ellwood. But, you know, even if there's one Tory candidate of competence and integrity and one who's not, one who's been a Johnson follower, perhaps the party might take a sensible approach in reaction to the way that they've gone in recent years. People do say to me, Mike, why do you bother? Why do you bother worrying about who the Tory leader is? They're all as bad as each other. Actually, I don't think they are. I know you could cite the voting record of some of the key people that I've referenced and show me that they've voted the same way as Johnson on many occasions. But that doesn't necessarily reflect their own beliefs. There's a limit to how much you can rebel if you want to still be in position to take the leadership reins at some point. So why do I pay any attention to who the Tory leader and Prime Minister would be? Because barring unforeseen circumstances, this is the only way that we can get a Prime Minister of competence and integrity within the next few years. Johnson is not going to reform. They don't have to call a general election until 2024 and may well not call one before 2023. So to get any change in the Prime Minister needs a change of Tory leader. And in my view, that's worth doing something about. Whatever your issue is, relationship with Europe, trade, handling of COVID, hospitals, doctors, nurses, schools, teaching, police, social care, the countryside, transport, whatever your issue is, international relationships, whatever your key issues are, I think it's worth having a Prime Minister of competence and integrity. And I think it's worth working for that to happen as soon as possible. There are people who are more honest and more competent in the Tory party than those in the cabinet at the moment. So what could we be doing about that? What I'd suggest is raising questions about values and decency and integrity and competence, you know, versus crony contracting and mishandling in letters to Tory MPs without getting into any specifics of leadership challenge. If we convey the message that those things are important, and, you know, a dozen letters from different people on a common theme can have an impact on an MP. Not photocopied letters, not copy and paste. Those tend to get ignored. But letters that raise constituents' concerns on things that may resonate with the MPs as well do stand a chance of getting through. And the backbench Tory MPs have at all times their WhatsApp groups. They can share what they think the big concerns are. So we do stand a chance of influencing them for good. And that's what I would suggest. But what would you suggest? What are your thoughts on what I've said? Who do you think is going to be the next Prime Minister? Do add your thoughts in the comments on the video. And if you found this interesting, please subscribe to the channel. Thank you.